It's something of a cliche for those chairing to say that this became no introduction. But I suspect today that is the case. Just because he's well known doesn't mean that he shouldn't be properly introduced. David is Professor Emeritus of Modern Church History in the University of Cambridge, where he had a distinguished academic career, perhaps exemplified in the award of the Doctorate in Divinity from Cambridge on the basis of his published works. We could now spend quite some time talking about his published works. What I would like to say is that alongside the peer-reviewed articles, the invited chapters and monographs, he published several notable papers in the Society's journal, and I'm grateful to continue to do that. He served the Society faithfully over many years as a former president and currently a librarian, and served the United Reformed Church Fridays committee convener, moderator of General Assembly, minister of the Word and Sacraments, and many other roles. He speaks to us today on what are the crisis in mid-20th century congregationalism in England and Wales, and we look forward to hearing what he's got to say.
This is a topic which has grown, and I say that simply to explain the fact that it may be regarded as possibly rambling in places, but then that goes with age as well. I've chosen to focus on the 1960s, not for any of the reasons for which that decade in British history is usually remembered: changes in official morality, final recovery from the Second World War, the movement from the atom bomb to the hydrogen bomb, or even the launch of the first spacecraft, though that was not by the United Kingdom, but for a simple reason. The Congregational Union of England and Wales was transformed into the Congregational Church of England and Wales. Why did this happen, and what was its significance? Because the change of name was followed so quickly by the formation of the United Reformed Church in 1972, the significance of the earlier change has not received the attention it deserved, as I discovered, somewhat to my surprise, when I was doing the background reading for an edition of a Declaration of Faith adopted by the Assembly of the Congregational Church of England and Wales in May 1967 by a German publisher for their series on Reform Confessions. Virtually everyone who has written on the history of Congregationalism in the 20th century has commented on the attempt to widen, centralize, or bureaucratize the Congregational Union of England and Wales. The verbs vary from author to author, but the reality they seek to describe is the same. Similar tendencies may be noticed among the Baptists, the Methodists, and even the Church of England, although they're very rarely linked. But the reality, either because they're not noticed, or, I suspect, because the significance of their similarity is not perceived. The similarity to other trends in English social history, in education, old age pensions, and health provision, is rarely noticed either. I'll return to this wider point at the end of my talk. As far as Congregationalism is concerned, these efforts may be traced back to the two chairman's addresses given by Dr. Joseph Parker in 1901. Elected in the previous year, as usual, Parker was one of the most respected ministers in Congregationalism, called to the office of chairman for the second time, not unique, but infrequent. Sadly, he'd been shattered by the death of his wife on the 26th of January, 1899. His obituary called it his death blow. 1901 was an unusual year in that both congregational assemblies were joint ones. The spring assembly was held with the Baptist Union in London, and the autumn assembly was held jointly with the Congregational Unions of Scotland and Ireland. Parker's two addresses at the spring and autumn assemblies of 1901 were nonetheless bold, with the same title, the United Congregational Church. Recalling that he'd recently attended a meeting on the development of Congregationalism, where he had voted against a proposal to connect the county unions more closely with the Congregational Union, he explained that he could see the Congregational Union gaining a great deal from close connection with the county unions, whereas the county unions had little to gain from close connection with the Congregational Union as at present constituted. And that emphasis on the last words is mine, not his. Or at least I didn't hear him speak, so I don't know, but that's my guess. The union was only a deliberative body with no executive mandate from the county unions or churches. He began the substance of his address by asking, what right has Congregationalism to live? To a large extent, they had lived under shelter of the words, where two or three are gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst of them. But who gave us as Congregationalists, he said, the fee simple of those words? Are they not the common property of Christendom? Noting that in the evolution of what he called literal independency, a great step was taken in the forming of what is known as the county union, which he described as, in outline, a sort of foreshadowed denominational millennium. If in earlier days, he asked, independent churches created a county union, especially note the word union, why in later days cannot all the county unions go still further and deeper in the same direction and create, with adequate safeguards, the United Congregational Church, which throughout his two addresses he spelt with capital letters. Parker's question was, of course, not only rhetorical, it was loaded deliberately. He recognized that not everyone would agree with him, but hoped to persuade them by seeking to answer certain questions. He sketched a wide vision that ultimately this united congregational church might embrace Congregationalists and Baptists, the Scottish Congregational Union, Congregationalists in the colonies, perhaps even Presbyterians. He had been moved by attending the celebrations of the union of the Free Church of Scotland and the United Presbyterian Church in Edinburgh the year before, in 1900. His overall aim was to replace what he called the Congregationalism of the last 30 years with the creation and full equipment, again my emphasis, of an institution to be known as the United Congregational Church. This full equipment included, first, a ministerial sustentation fund, but without sustaining laziness or proved inefficiency, common objection to this proposal in the previous few years. His intention was to sustain God's gentlefolk, the faithful but obscure ministers who were not outstanding preachers, but faithful pastors. There would not be a uniform and inflexible way of receiving and recognizing ministers. How could there be if described like that? My words, not his. But there had to be some method of recognition. He denied that this had to be by means of a college education, noting the number of men in science and literature whose recognized distinction was not owed to any college. A list, interestingly, beginning with the Sandemanian Michael Faraday, John Stuart Mill, Herbert Spencer, and congregational ministers like Dr. Robert Vaughan or Edward White. Parker did not regard the Christian ministry as a close borough. The pre-1832 description of constituencies that were controlled by 2 or 3 wealthy people. Parker's vision would preserve the central principle of congregationalism, which finds expression in the individual church. Beyond all doubt that individual churches can be related. We are not contemplating the destruction of congregationalism, but its perfection. He gave hypothetical examples of how different county unions could complement each other if brought into close union, indeed describing the county union as the point of equipoise between isolation, in which sympathy is dead, and centralisation, in which responsibility is lost. Similarly, he looked forward to a renewed mutual appreciation of city pastors and rural ministers. Moreover, Parker hoped for the best use to be made of all the resources of congregationalism. Did they really need 7 or 8 theological colleges, probably worth more than £25,000? Would not 3, one in Oxford, one in Cambridge, and one in Durham, be enough for England? Were they making the best use of all the resources of the many trusts, funds, and charities listed in the yearbook? Certainly anyone looking at them today must be struck by their number and diversity. Could some of the nearly abandoned churches in deserted parts of great cities be turned into mission centres, perhaps taking inspiration from the Wesleyan 20th Century Fund? Essentially, Parker appealed for a broader vision. He ended his first address by saying that he hoped God would mercifully grant me early release from my long and arduous ministry. He wanted to share his deepest thoughts before he died. I do not, speaking for myself alone, he said, want congregationalism repaired. I want congregationalism completed. The autumn assembly was held in Manchester. Parker's second address repeated the outline of the spring proposal, though he did explain that he had searched for a topic worthy of their attention and of the beginning of the 20th century, which had led him to the Federation of Congregationalism throughout the world. A bold vision indeed. He recalled the original resolution of John Angel James in May 1831, that it is highly desirable and important to establish a union of congregational churches throughout England and Wales, founded on the broadest recognition of their own distinctive principle, namely the scriptural right of every separate church to maintain perfect independence in the government and administration of its own particular affairs. Parker claimed that his idea need not threaten the principle of local autonomy, but he did ask what in the 20th century, with its new locomotion, its new literature, and its enlarging interrelation, was meant by every separate church, and what its own particular affairs were. Using a somewhat unusual image, he suggested that every sheep in a flock may have a scriptural right to its own breathing apparatus and its own digestive functions, but the moment a sheep becomes infectiously diseased, the whole flock has a scriptural right to be protected from a contagious malady. Nor should Congregationalists quietly or churlishly unchurch other communions which acknowledge no such scriptural right while reading the same scriptures and coming to totally opposite conclusions. The language Paul used in his letters in the New Testament always emphasized the whole fellowship of the churches rather than the particular rites of each one. Arguing that any living institution must go forward or backward, he asserted that to stand still is to die. It was a poor policy that said, touch nothing, change nothing, let everything remain undisturbed. And he illustrated this by referring to the coming together of Upper and Lower Canada in 1867, the formation of the Commonwealth of Australia in the same year as he was speaking, the creation of the London County Council, and even a single Lord Mayor of Manchester rather than several separate mayors. He further argued that it was vital that any consolidation, his preferred word, of Congregationalism had to be the work of the whole Congregational Union itself, and then briefly sketched out a process to bring it about. Unsurprisingly, the Assembly did not commit itself to, and I quote the minutes, any premature approval or disapproval of Dr. Parker's proposal, but it did express its appreciation to him for bringing the issues before them, and directed the committee to take steps to bring those issues before the churches, which it did by appointing a special committee of 25 members, of whom 1/3 had not to be members of the existing General Committee. Its report to the Assembly of 1903 had two parts, a new draft constitution and a set of statistics of responses from churches and county unions to different models for closer cooperation. The detailed statistics were then set out, and I've circulated them in the handout I've given. No county union approved absolutely Parker's scheme, probably no surprise there, but 6 gave it general approval, representing 82,000, well, nearly 83,000 members. 10 supported closer federation but no particular scheme, representing 54,000 members. 7 supported organic association with the county unions, representing another 72,000 members. And you'll see the significance of that at the size of the churches in that group of 7. But only 23 out of 37 unions even responded. It's not really very great, 2/3. And of the churches, there were 252, total members 28,000, nearly 29, voted for the proposal. 168 churches, total members 30,000 or so, voted against it. 75, with total membership of 11,000, gave general approval. And 80, total members 18,000, approved closer federation but no scheme. And 69, total members 13,000, wanted to associate the Congregational Union and county unions. And then, this is the bit in the figures I don't understand, 149 churches representing 31,000 total membership were for closer federation, with the larger churches in favour, and 46 churches, that's say 9,000 members, advised the Congregational Union to seek further powers or other changes. No one seems to have preferred United Congregational Church as a title and wanted to stick to Congregational Union. The committee pointed out that only 509 churches out of 1,300 had voted, but it didn't seem that there was widespread enthusiasm for change. Courteously, no one pointed out that in the meantime Parker had died. The special committee's primary proposal was therefore a revised constitution, which was recommended unanimously by the Assembly to the churches and county unions. And the final report noted that county unions and churches alike expressed their obligation to Dr. Parker for his addresses, recognizing that he had obtained a measure of attention for the problems of congregational reform, such as no other man among us could have secured. That may be so, but I suspect Parker himself would have thought the result was something of a mouse. Nevertheless, the significance of the introduction of a congregational council to replace the old union committee should not be underestimated, as I fear most congregational historians have done. The revised constitution provided that the total membership should be about 300, obviously too large for an effective administrative group, chosen by county unions in proportion to their membership. It controlled the union's business departments and administered their funds, nominated members of its committees, submitted their annual reports and accounts to the Assembly, nominated the names of Assembly administrative committees to the Assembly, framed rules of procedure for the Assembly, and considered any amendments to its constitution, considered and acted on Assembly resolutions, and fostered relations with other congregational bodies. It specified 10 standing committees from finance to temperance. In short, there was virtually nothing in the new situation the Assembly could do without council approval. And this attack, my word, on the Assembly of the Union itself may have diverted attention from the implications of the failure to secure a solid financial basis for union initiatives other than by membership subscriptions. In an article on the Jubilee of the Congregational Council in 1957, Cecil Northcote described the years 1902 to 6 as those when organised life in the Congregational Union was undergoing some sharp criticisms and some constructive proposals. The old independency was passing, and the emerging forms of the modern 20th century were being fitted with new instruments. The chief administrative innovation was the council, which was given a wide mandate, and he gave a list of the mandate. And then he went on, this sounds like a modern agenda for a council meeting, for every one of those problems is still with us, and some of them even more sharply than in 1902. Here, I hope you see why I began an address notionally on the 1960s by immediately diving back 60 years. It would, however, be wrong to assume that the Union did nothing after it changed its constitution in 1904. Naturally, it took some time to get it up and running, but small, though significant changes continued to be made to meet changing conditions, not least in education, most obviously at the secondary level because of the Butler Act of 1942, but also in the day-to-day operation of university entrance and state scholarship support after the Second World War. More significant changes were taking place ecumenically on the world level, just as the First World War was beginning, with the formation of the International Missionary Council, and the beginnings of faith and order and life and work movements at the end of the war, the Lambeth Conference of 1920, and the conversations with the English free churches by the Church of England in the early 1920s. By the 1930s, there were new problems in international relations and the beginning of the end of empire for the United Kingdom. I would suggest that the very able leadership in ministry, missions, and theological education, which the Congregational Union enjoyed in this period, helped to conceal some of the difficulties faced by Congregationalism following the Second World War. Sidney Berry had been a pillar of stability as the Secretary of the Union between 1923 and 48. He was followed by Leslie Cook, who had a significant 10-year ministry in Coventry, 1938 to 48, which led to the Chapel of Unity in the rebuilt Coventry Cathedral after the war. Secretary of the Union between 1948 and 55, who surprised his colleagues by accepting the new post of Director of the World Council of Churches Refugee and Interchurch Aid Service in Geneva, now in this country known as Christian Aid, and then Howard Stanley, the Secretary of the Lancashire Union between 1946 and 56, and the Secretary of the Union from 1956 to 64. Stanley will probably be remembered for the work that resulted from his address to the Union the next 10 years in May 1959. His reputation was based on his ministry in the Bolton group of churches between 1932 and 45, from which he went to be Secretary of the Lancashire Union and Provincial Moderator between 1945 and 56. On the national stage, he was involved in various missions and forward movements. Although born in Shropshire, with initial ministries in the south, he was identified with the north of England from his work in Lancashire. He did sterling work as County Commissioner for the Union's Reconstruction Fund in the late 1930s, and made his national reputation as chairman of the Home Churches Fund after 1945, which guaranteed a minimum stipend for ministers and increased assistance to ministers' widows' pensions. His sturdy opposition to Congregational Presbyterian Union in 1947, followed by his later support for it in the 1950s and 60s, led Alan Sell to describe it as, I quote, surely one of the most significant reconsiderations in the history of 20th century Congregationalism. Alan Argent writes, almost accusingly, that Stanley's dramatic reversal requires explanation, and wondered whether he merely took on the colour of his surroundings by moving from Lancashire to London. The possibility that his change of mind, which is not disputed, might have been genuine is not considered. It was clearly shared by several Congregationalists in the 1950s, and as observers of the conversations in the Joint Committee in the 1960s, we never supposed that union was a done deal. The proposal of Stanley's name as a successor to Cook in 1955 failed to gain the support of a quarter of the Congregational Council, and Stanley did not accept the nomination. He did accept it a year later, when the majority was significantly larger, and he took a year to discover the union's needs by touring the country. In the address, The Next 10 Years, Stanley argued that the immediate post-war recovery had been achieved, and he identified 8 areas of church life he felt required review. The identified issues were: 1, the relation of the churches to each other, the county unions and the Congregational Union, the nature of Christian unity and Christian oversight. 2, a statement of faith, the 20th century. 3, the problems of church extension, the need to concentrate resources, assistance for rural churches, and how to recruit lay pastors. 4, the life and work of local churches as centres of spiritual vitality. 5, the missionary obligations of the churches as expressed in the relationship between the Congregational Union and its missionary societies, or congregational missionary societies. 6, the recruitment of ministers. 7, the church's moral influence on the community. And 8, the machinery of the Congregational Union itself. To be fair to Stanley, the changes proposed by the 8 Assembly Commissions were not Stanley's proposals, but those of the Assembly, insofar as they were accepted. In referring to the Congregational Council earlier, I cited Cecil Northcott's observation in 1959 that all the issues on the wide mandate given to the Council were still with us, some even more sharply than 50 years earlier. Although not the only commission concerned with structural issues, Commission 1 on the relations between the churches, county unions and the Congregational Union most obviously, though apparently unconsciously, looked back to the questions Joseph Parker had asked at the beginning of the century. The Council had clearly streamlined much of the Union's work, but the report of Commission 1 in 1960 suggested a further step, which was not new, that the member churches of the Union should enter a covenanted relationship with one another and adopt the title the Congregational Church in England and Wales. This drew on some of the historical work done since the 1930s on the significance of the idea of covenant in the origins of Congregationalism, while emphasizing the fact that such a relationship would depend on the willing act of the local churches concerned. The responses from churches were presented to the 1962 Assembly. 82 voted against, 89 wished for more detail, and 656 had voted in favour. A council recommended resolution was moved and seconded that a serious attempt be made to work out the implications of the main findings of Commission 1, somewhat watered down from the original. An amendment that in the draft constitution, if any, the full freedom of our congregational polity shall be strictly preserved, was heavily defeated. The council recommendation was accepted with fewer than a dozen votes in opposition. 18 names were approved for the draft constitution committee with provision for the filling of vacancies and also for adding representatives of the conservative evangelical group, the churches in Wales, and the women of the churches. 2 points are striking about this discussion. The first is the sharp contrast between those sentiments and the sentiments in 1902. The second is that even at this stage it was clear that it was going to be difficult to reconcile the two positions. A year later, a first report from the Draft Constitution Committee was received, and it was agreed by an overwhelming majority that the report should be sent to the churches and county unions for their consideration. There was also discussion concerning a commentary on the report, which had been written to explain the proposal to local churches. Dr. Alfred Thomas, Director of Education for Leicester and Secretary of the Reverend R.W. Cleaves's church at Clarendon Park, Leicester, moved that there also be sent a similarly printed document bearing the divergent views that are circulating among us. This provoked considerable discussion. Anyone who thinks about it can imagine, how could you imagine setting out a document containing a number of divergent views? Difficult enough to do something with one. It was defeated when put to the assembly. That was interpreted by opponents as an attempt by the centre to prevent publicity for dissentient views. It's quite a large centre. One of the opponents, that is, drafted 6 reasons why the draft constitution is not acceptable and printed it at his own expense. And a conference was held in Birmingham in October 1964 when a number of keen people, I quote, attended to consider the future of Congregationalism. John Wilcox, on behalf of the newly formed Congregational Association, wrote to all church secretaries after the conference in November 1964, setting out the case of historic Congregationalists, his words, against the new constitution, and circulated a questionnaire for local churches to fill in. The expected answers were pretty obvious. The actual date when the Congregational Association was formed is unclear. The Congregational Monthly declined to give it publicity. Cleves seems to waver between assuming it was 1964 by referring to a Congregational Manifesto, February 1967, and citing a later declaration of intent by the association in January 1969, implying its formal existence by referring to its executive committee. I think it's pretty clear 1964 is the date. Alan Argent was right to attempt a simplification by saying that some opponents of union with the Presbyterians started the Congregational Association to ensure that Congregationalism would continue, but doesn't suggest a date. John Travell begins his story from the Birmingham Conference of October 1964 and notes that apart from Bunyan meeting in Bedford, all the churches represented were from the Midlands and the North. Actually, he also says that Bedford was the only exception to that group, though John Brown, minister of Bunyan meeting, when he was chairman of the Union in 1891, described himself as a proud Midlander when chairman. So I think you could say everything north of the Midlands was where those churches came from. In fact, the mixing of issues surrounding formation of the Congregational Church and opposition to the formation of the United Reformed Church, whilst historically illuminating, does not aid seeing the difference between a wish to preserve positive features of Congregationalism and to oppose the model of Christian unity based on organic union. Nor was it helped by the delay in voting on the union proposals and a process which, as a result of trying to reach a final decision, entailed negligible wider consultation on the final text of the bill to settle the property of the URC. The 1964 Assembly also received a proposal from the Loughborough Church, to which Wilcox belonged, to alter the constitution of the Congregational Union to enable any church to submit a resolution to alter the constitution, provided it had the support of its county union or 50 churches. For it to become effective immediately, the 90% vote in favour would be required. A smaller majority would require a postal ballot of all member churches within 6 months, and if a 75% was found to be in favour, the alteration would come into effect immediately. The Secretary of the Draft Constitution Committee, to which the Council had referred this proposal, explained that committee's views, and in the vote, only 7 voted in favour, and it was rejected by a very large majority. This shows the tenacious way in which the opposition to Commission 1 was pursued in the Assembly. 1965 to 66 was the year in which local churches voted on whether to covenant to become part of the new Congregational Church of England and Wales or not. At the Assembly of 1966, the first business after the introductory sessions was the replacement of the 1904 Constitution by the new draft Constitution. An amendment seeking the right of non-covenanting churches to retain the right to vote on the Constitution was lost by an overwhelming majority. Ask what the relationship would be between churches that had not covenanted but wished to remain in fellowship with the congregation would be, John Huxtable replied, that meetings would be held with representatives of such churches to work out the most satisfactory relationship that satisfied all. He further stated that so far 1,761 churches had covenanted, representing 80% of the total CU membership. 41 churches had declined, 1.2% of the membership. 56 churches had deferred a decision, and 24 were in correspondence. When put to the vote, the resolution to form the Congregational Church received 1,766 votes in favour and 42 against, and it was declared carried by the required majority. Members of the Assembly stood while it was signed by the Chairman and Secretary and all the ex-chairmen of the Congregational Union present. A number of evangelical congregational churches had already formed the Evangelical Fellowship of Congregational Churches and withdrawn from the Congregational Union, which was regretted by those in the Congregational Association because it weakened the potential strength of possible opposition to the new Congregational Presbyterian Union. The fellowship, it was explained, was a development on a church level of the Congregational Evangelical Revival Fellowship, which had been restricted to individuals. Without going into the details of the next few years, I think that they illustrate the extent to which assembly-going Congregationalists have become accustomed to following the lead set by the Council, such that criticism or opposition was easily equated with disloyalty, and differences that have been tolerated for many years rapidly moved towards polarization. That also had the negative effect of turning questions into issues of trust. Who is to be believed, and what are their motives? Matters then become very personal, and there are marks of that in the history. It does not seem to be the case, for example, that congregations that were declining were more likely to come down eventually on the side of the Federation rather than those who became part of the United Reformed Church in 1972. The financial record of the Federation churches is quite impressive, nor do there seem to have been decisive regional differences. Was this a crisis? I think it is difficult to avoid some such word in a situation where a group of people entered a decade as part of a single grouping, which 10 years later was divided into 4. Tudor Jones uses the term the modern religious crisis to describe the whole period from 1930 to 1962. Clearly, one must notice that this was all set in the context of what was only slowly perceived as a steady and relentless decline in church affiliation, however understood, the baptized, church members, church attenders. It was also one in which the traditional 19th century evangelical methods of missions and revivals were either not succeeding or were less long-lasting in their effects. That resulted in increasing tension between those who wanted to break from old patterns and try new ones, and those who claimed that more faith and prayer were all that was needed, which added a new edge to an emerging difference of view over biblical interpretation. There was also perhaps a distinctively Congregationalist dimension to these problems. Tedder Jones observed in the 1930s that English Congregationalists submitted themselves to rigorous and prolonged self-examination on a scale never attempted before. Not an aspect of the life and doctrine of the churches was left unexamined. Nothing was left unanalyzed. 20th century Congregationalism was very articulate, with several channels through which discontent could be voiced. Those who formed the Congregational Association were not insignificant people in the churches. There was also a distinctive congregational commitment to Christian unity in the various forms that was expressed in the 20th century, from the Free Church Council movement of the 1890s through the early international movements from 1910 to the ecumenical conferences between 1925 and 1938. Prominent individuals before 1945 that included Alfred Garvey, Norman Goodall, and Nathaniel Micklem. Dr. Robert Paul served as Associate Director of the new Ecumenical Institute at the Château de Bossy from 1954 to 1958. His subsequent ministry was in the United States. It was not surprising that Leslie Cook should have moved to Geneva, and in some ways it was a measure of the differing breadths of vision within the Congregational Union that it had seemed so. Perhaps in some ways an indication of the slow decline of imperial thinking. Traditional Congregationalists seemed to find it easier to accept councils of churches than united churches. They seemed to regard a council as more open to wider Christian unity than an organic union. The various groups did not differ over the desirability of Christian union. They did have different visions of what it looked like. And we might extend this analysis a step further. There were not only different visions of union, there were different expectations for what the churches needed to do together. 19th century nonconformity had initially been primarily concerned with missions overseas and the removal of nonconformist civil disabilities at home, both of which were gradually achieved. But the search for wider political equality had been diverted into more controversial issues such as education and disestablishment, which remained unsolved in the early 20th century. Questions of social and economic reform and equality became more prominent, and church members wanted to claim these areas of life for Christian involvement, leading to priority for Sunday schools and other forms of youth work. Such activity was not cost-free, but it is not easy to track down its exact size. Church accounts were kept, but rarely published, so the research required is laborious for an uncertain end. Certainly not a step to be taken lightly in 20th century higher education. It is possible, indeed probable, that the agricultural depression of the last quarter of the 19th century had a disproportionate effect on the life of rural Congregationalism. Albert Spicer, MP, Congregational Union chairman in 1893, lamented the disappearance of small farmers and changing agricultural methods. J.B. Peyton, in a conference on Christian economics at the Autumn Assembly of 1897, cited the recent work of respected historians like Thorold Rogers on rural life of a generational nature, which implied the disappearance of the typical Congregationalist farmer. The reduction in the agricultural population from over 1 million in 1851, well over 1 million, to 787,000 in 1891 was dramatic. The decline in the birth rate in the 20th century reduced population size and growth potential. The main cause of 19th century nonconformist growth had been the increased population. Because such socioeconomic changes are diffuse and difficult to fit into simple cause-effect analyses, they've often simply been ignored by church historians. A little more may be added about the size of churches. Church historians often concentrate on ministers who were powerful preachers who sustained large congregations. But inevitably, such churches were largely confined to the larger towns and cities. Peter Jones observed that at the beginning of the 20th century, Congregationalism was primarily a denomination of small churches. And he cites a breakdown of provincial church membership in 1902, excluding the London Union and the Kent metropolitan areas, which shows the figures that are also on your handout. I won't go through them. Reflect for a moment how many ministers, that many churches with that membership structure requires and what the financial implications are. Add to that the questions concerning pensions for ministers and widows with increasing life expectancy, and you see how the underlying socioeconomic changes work themselves out over time. Is it then surprising that certain issues of size and concentration of resources keep on recurring? Is it surprising that people with the experience and insight of Leslie Cook might not think it self-evident that it was best to rebuild bombed churches where they had been rather than where they might best be placed for the 1940s and 50s? I have a final section which I won't bother to go through, but it relates to Ebenezer Cunningham's address from the chair of the Congregational Union in 1953, entitled Faith, Finance and Fellowship. This came a couple of years after half the staff at Memorial Hall had been sacked to save £5,000. Cunningham was a layman, a mathematics fellow and tutorial bursar of St John's College, Cambridge, choirmaster and later church secretary of Emmanuel Church, Cambridge. He, in that address, was saying the same sorts of things about the future for small local churches and the need to concentrate resources, as you might expect a bursar to do. And he paid tribute to the work of Dr. Cook in the Forward movement, the biggest challenge we've received in my memory. And he concluded by noting their fellowship with those who'd gone before, as represented in the £50,000 the union had received in investment income, more than a third of the union's income for all purposes. and it led to his final section on the cost of all this and what was involved. He reckoned that the total additional sum that needed to be raised in 53 to 54 was 104,000 as against a present income of 71,000. The extra £33,000 needed was nearly 75% of the present Home Churches Fund quota. He reminded members that around 3/4 of the total extra required was for the support of ministers, active or retired, and their widows. Against that, the whole sum could be covered by twopence farthing a week from every member recorded in the yearbook statistics. So he looked forward to raising the sum required with ease and a similar increase in giving for other causes as well. Well, the Assembly responded and set up a committee to do that. And when I joined the Congregational Presbyterian Joint Committee in 1966, the discussions immediately made clear that Congregationalist finances were still a matter of concern, and that if anything destroyed the union, it would be the financial bankruptcy of the Congregational Union. This crisis didn't come out of the blue. You may be uncomfortable with the wide-ranging scope of Joseph Parker's articulation of both the problems and his solution, but the minimalism of the response, as indicated by the revised Constitution of 1904, was as much a cause of the later crisis as its cure. The Council focused the business of the Congregational Union, but the underlying problems of operating a structure which in essence set the supporters of different emphases in church life in competition with one another for financial resources from the same potential body of supporters, a free market solution, if you like, did not provide an effective way of determining Congregationalist priorities or providing the necessary financial support. As it happened, in the end, the change from Congregational Union to church didn't provide a sufficient basis for union to enable the union to proceed. And that's why the bill in 1970 was delayed, because it became necessary to amend more than had been anticipated. And that's why it never got discussed. Not even by members of the Joint Committee, though I'm not sure that anybody's said that in public before. What the bill did, of course, was to substitute an appeal procedure, which was solidly based, for the independence of every church procedure, which is what the Congregational Union had. Arguably, the appeal procedure is more soundly based and offers a better protection, just as the Executive Committee of the United Reformed Church, as it was initially set up, we've now gone back to that title again, was more modelled, though this wasn't appreciated and certainly not publicised at the time, on the pattern of the Congregational Council that it ever was on the previous Executive Committee of the Presbyterian Church of England. That's why the Executive Committee still controls so much of what happens in the United Reformed Church. You can see how it grew. Yes, still tight.
Thank you.